I don't know anything about China. Venture into a changing world. You can't actually just simply walk away. Gorillas can dance, happy accidents, China depth and global breadth, obliquity, frugality, paradoxicality, forming, consolidating, and extending the relationship.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining me. I've been waiting for this interview for quite some time. We had to reschedule a couple of times because of the schedules, but I'm happy that it's finally happening. And I'm pretty excited about this book.
Thank you.
I start reading. I haven't finished. Crazy busy this past few days, but I really appreciate it. And if you can sign for me, it would be really, really amazing.
An absolute pleasure. So, well, thank you very much for having me on this very iconic series of interviews. And
that's all my pleasure. We have a beautiful weather today, which is also good.
Yes.
And, Shanghai finally cooling down, and it's good to be outside.
Mm-hmm.
Just few days like this, right? The spring and autumn is super short in Shanghai, so we need to enjoy all this. A few days outside. That's super amazing. This is actually, I think this is one of the first book I have that it's signed by the author.
Oh,
super cool.
very pleased to hear that. So.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Gorillas Can Dance, amazing. Definitely recommend you to read this book. We're going to talk a little bit about during the interview, but make sure you have the screenshot. All right. So it's been already a while you are in China. So let's start with the traditional question. What's your China story? Why did you come here? When did it happen? Was it Shanghai or maybe other smaller places? What's your journey in China?
So I came to China 11 years ago. I'm a business school academic. I was teaching at Glasgow University. And in fact, my very first class, and that's always very memorable for an academic, the first time you walk into the classroom and teach. I had about 100 master's students in Glasgow University. And I walk in, and I kid you not, about 85 of them were from China. So it was like, am I in Glasgow or in Guangzhou, And this was about 2006, and clearly, as an international business academic and teaching about the subject, emerging markets were very important to talk about. And I realized that there was a gap in my knowledge about China. So about 4 years later, in 2010, I saw this advertisement from Nottingham University's China campus, and someone I just met at a conference had become the new dean and was saying, we're very interested to hire people for this campus. So I sent him a one-line email. I said, I don't know anything about China. Can I apply? And he said, well, I think you do know a little bit about emerging markets, because my research was covering both Scottish companies but also Indian companies. And he said, as long as you're open to learning, then that's the most important thing. And at that point, that was the big draw to come and experience China, to start learning a little bit about it. So I took a year's leave of absence from Glasgow University, and it was a very sort of strategic timing for me from a personal point of view. So we just had our second child, who was a year old when we moved, and our older child was 4 years old. So I took 1 year's leave of absence, and I thought, if this doesn't work out great, we go back to Scotland, and my daughter would be the right age to join primary school. but then 11 years on, here we are. So 4 years into my time in Ningbo, which was absolutely great, I unexpectedly was tapped by CEIBS to move to Shanghai, and that was another very interesting, exciting experience. So that's my China story so far.
So the first city was Ningbo.
Ningbo for 4 years at Nottingham University's China campus.
I think it's pretty cool because for me it happened the same thing, right? I spent a couple of years in the beginning in Shijiazhuang, which is Hebei province, and I think that's the way you actually see a bit, different China.
Absolutely.
Right,
yes.
and then you have different opinions. You can compare. You can draw some conclusions. That's I think very valuable experience to live or spend some time in smaller cities, right? Not just Shanghai or Beijing. Interesting, and I mean, I'm also curious. How about your wife? I mean, that was your decision to come to China, and she was happy about the decision.
She was very open to an adventure. I think we were very clear. Our family was complete. Her area was human resources, and she was working for a company in Glasgow, which was handling the payroll operations for big British companies. And they decided to move their operations to Krakow, Poland. So she had a job in Poland if she wanted it. So the timing of that too was interesting. And so there were more degrees of freedom, and we were going to try this out for a year basically. And she was up for an adventure, so it wouldn't have worked otherwise. And
interesting.
She's loved being in China. My kids have now. That's pretty much all they've known, really.
And it's been, like you said, already 11 years in China. You've seen definitely lots of changes. So if you think about it, what are the biggest changes here in China that you have observed, both on the personal level and maybe professional level?
I mean, I think we came in 2011, and that's the year, as it turns out, WeChat was created. And so it was my good fortune to basically have a ringside view into the rise of the mobile internet era, and that's given rise to sort of a AI age and so on. So just in terms of digital technology, as your audience knows very well, that's just been a very fascinating thing to observe. The other thing has been watching how internationalization of companies has also sort of evolved. I think for a few years there was this great excitement, both in terms of Chinese companies going out, and then also multinationals being excited about what they were seeing here, and then a period where a whole bunch of issues have, I think, slowed things down, geopolitically, the pandemic and so on. But what I've seen as a constant is the recognition about the importance of innovation. And that's just been fascinating to observe. And I think people like us who have been around on the ground here in China, even over these past 2-3 years, which have seen so much disruption around the world. I mean, you can see that the companies that take it seriously and the people who do, I think are making very important strides, which I'm not sure is fully appreciated everywhere.
I like about that you mentioned about the innovation. We've seen lots of changes and they keep going, right? In different areas, different industries. So innovation is kind of a priority, one of the direction that many, smaller governments and bigger companies as well addressing all the time. Let's have a quick look about the Gorillas Can Dance, right? So this is the book, and here in Shanghai, and I'm sure beyond Shanghai, in many other countries, people talk about it, especially in the startup circles. That's something very exciting. I think we're not going to go deep into details because we want people to actually read themselves. But for those who never heard about this book, if you can give just a quick intro, what is it about?
Gorillas Can Dance is about how large companies can partner effectively with startups. And the book talks about three things broadly: the why, the how, and the where. And the why is, I think, pretty intuitive to understand. It's, a lot of disruption, the need for innovation being recognized by the big companies, and also a bit of humility to realize that not everything needs to be done by oneself. I think there are echoes of this idea of open innovation that Henry Chesbrough of Berkeley talks about. One way to do this is to engage with startups, which leads to the question of how. And sort of the big insight I got in my work, and this is based on research for over 15 years, is there is an asymmetry, massive asymmetry, big differences between large companies and startups, obviously, and a paradox associated with this. And this paradox of asymmetry is the very differences that make it attractive to work together. One has the scale, one has the agility, also makes it difficult, or at least not straightforward. So recognizing that, unpacking that, what are these different asymmetries, how do you overcome it, I think is key to understanding the how, and also being committed to developing the capability to work with startups. And then in terms of the where, I've tried to shed light on some of the differences between emerging markets, like China, India on the one hand versus, say, Western Europe and the United States. I also have had a great opportunity after moving to CEIBS to engage with Africa, because we have a small campus in Accra, Ghana. And I also talk a little bit about my observations in Africa and how corporate startup partnering can be a force for good. Because a lot of these startups in Africa engaging with large companies are social enterprises as well. So the why, the how, and the where of corporate startup partnering, that's what the book's about.
Wow, 15 years of research. So I'm just curious more about actually how did you write the book? Did you do it like step by step, or it was just thoughts and ideas, right? And then at some point you decided to put them together, or it was actually a long process of adding more and more chapters to the book?
So actually, initially, I just stumbled upon the phenomenon. So my doctoral work was about how startups go international. And I was studying in an international business unit in Scotland, which had made a name for itself in Europe by studying large multinationals. So many American companies had set up subsidiaries in Scotland over the years, and they had studied these. I was part of a new generation of researchers looking at how startups could go international. And as I was completing my PhD, I began to wonder, why are we talking about these two sets of companies in parallel? Because I could see that, for example, a startup in Scotland was trying to engage with the IBM subsidiary there, ultimately with the hope that they could leverage that network and go international. So I was beginning to see these sort of early signs that this may be possible. But I was actually studying the startups. So the first bit of writing of mine that got some attention was an article co-authored with a professor in London Business School called Julian Birkinshaw, titled Dancing with Gorillas. And it was about how the startups could engage with the big companies. And that title came from a throwaway comment from one senior professor who I was asking about this phenomenon. I said, I'm beginning to observe some startups partnering with large companies. Do you think it's worth investing the time to research this? And he said, I think for some of these smaller companies, they have no choice but to learn to dance with the big gorilla. So that's how it began. And I kind of got really fascinated with it and stayed with the phenomenon. And after moving to Shanghai in 2015, I began to see many of these big companies, not just in tech, which were the kinds of companies I was initially studying, like Microsoft or IBM, but also Ford, AB InBev, Barclays Bank, so many of these companies from traditional industries making an attempt to quite intentionally engage with startups. And that's when I started writing for the big company audience as well. And that's when Dancing with Gorillas flipped into Gorillas Can Dance. And then I would say the writing process I started working on from 2015, 2016. I started kind of identifying what I was able to probably add some value based on my research, what I should continue focusing on. And then I began to realize basically it's about the why, how, and the where. So I was slowly working on this, and then I think the pandemic helped to finally get the time to sit down and get the book length manuscript. Up until then, I'd had a series of articles.
One of few positive things, right, from the
that
pandemic.
came out of
A bit more time to sit
Yes.
down and spend some time on writing.
Yeah.
Is it your first book?
So I have a couple of books before that for academic audiences, what we call research monographs, which will only ever be bought by about 100 or 200 university libraries. This is my first book for a practitioner audience.
Any more coming up?
So as I mentioned about, my experience in Africa and so on, the note on which I end the book is by saying that partnering between corporations and startups can be viewed more broadly as non-traditional allies coming together. And I think that's actually going to be a very important part of our attempt to address the Sustainable Development Goals. The 17th of them is partnerships for the goals. And if you look at the documentation, it's a lot about governments working with other governments, civil society and governments. But I think companies have a role to play, and all of the above. So yes, my hope is that the next book will be about collaboration among non-traditional allies for the Sustainable Development Goals.
I look forward to that.
Thank you.
Then we probably have another interview. So you already started talking about the startups and corporates and how they collaborate. And you mentioned as well that while you've been here, I know you've seen this up and downs, right? And that's actually also, I was starting my business that time, 2015, 16, but everything was going up, lots of events, lots of companies coming in, lots of companies going out. We did many hackathons, and that's actually when we also start working with the corporates. And that was the Startup Corporate Collaboration. It was in the form that corporates say, hey, we want to do the hackathon, we want to attract developers, we want to create people who bring their ideas. And it was a lot of things going on. But then people really quickly realized that it's not the best way to do the startup corporate collaboration, because after the weekend of pizza prototypes and a lot of excitement, there is nothing happening next week. There is no follow-up. There is no actually proper agenda how to develop all these partnerships. And then we see a bit more structured things, right? Where actually there were a program with sprints and also maybe hackathons, workshops, putting all together over a longer period of time. So where I'm heading it, I'm trying to understand what is the best way now in 2022 for startups and corporates to collaborate. Are there any successful models that probably trendy now?
No, I fully concur with everything you're saying. And in fact, this became one of the motivations for me to get this book done, because compared to 2008, when I wrote the Dancing with Gorillas articles and was struggling to find good examples, and the examples there seemed to really result from happy accidents. 10 years on, actually the problem I was worried about was a lot of big companies were now jumping onto the bandwagon and paying lip service to this. And, there was this tendency towards innovation theater. And so, in fact, the companies that I've talked about in the book, I think, have all been very serious about this and very committed to this. And that's one of the key points I try to make, which is if you want to engage with startups, it is effortful. It's not effortless. So I think by now we have a clearer understanding, I think, of which companies really take this seriously, and also which startups have the ability to dance well with the gorillas. So from the point of view of the gorillas, I think one of the key things to make this work is to realize that the people who are the bridge between the big company and the startups, the people who work in the partner interfaces, actually have two very important tasks. One is reaching out to the startup community, but that, it turns out, once you understand how to deal with the asymmetries, that's doable. Again, if you're committed and you're serious about it. In fact, the harder job is dealing inside the company. And because in the end, the startups are going to have meaningful opportunities only if business unit leaders provide these opportunities, and they need to be convinced of the value that the startups can add, and also build this capability for partnering. And so I think from the big company's point of view, what I would say is, if you're really serious about this, then the people tasked with interfacing with the startups should take the task of interfacing on the insides of the company just as seriously, if not more, because in some cases that's actually the harder part. From the point of view of the startups, what I would say is you need equal measures of optimism and pessimism.
This is the good one.
In fact, back in 2008, in that Dancing with Gorillas articles, we talk about three things: forming, consolidating, and extending the relationship. And basically for each of these, I think you need to have a pair of actions. When you're forming the relationship, be proactive, put your best foot forward, find ways to get an in, but at the same time, ensure that the big company is really genuinely committed, ascertain that they're serious about this. For example, see whether what they're saying they're interested in terms of startup collaboration matches with their strategic priorities. So when BMW was saying to startups, we're interested in improving our cybersecurity, that fit with what they were trying to do, and so they ended up engaging with startups in Israel and other ecosystems. But if the startup is basically the perceiving that this is just another round of pizza or something, is probably well worth staying away from that multinational. In terms of consolidating the relationship, I think you need to put your best foot forward. You get one chance to make a good impression. And sometimes what happens is the startup gets an opportunity that's a little peripheral. It's not quite in the zone. And, sometimes it's worth taking these opportunities as a way to get started. But on the other hand, there are some times where you actually need to turn down opportunities till you get the one that really matches your core area of strength. At the same time, sort of the pessimistic side of things is be cautious. There's this need for selective revealing, because the trick to pull off is you need to show enough of your capability that the corporate is interested, but not so much that they don't need you anymore. And then in terms of extending the relationship, I think actually that's where startups can get the biggest bang for their buck, because once you form a relationship with the corporate and then get a chance to work with their business units, say in other geographies or in other business lines, I think that's when it becomes really beneficial. There are these economies of scope that kick in, but at the same time, don't assume that it will only be this company, so keep your options open, look for other ways of, there may well be other gorillas to dance with.
Those are the good tips, because we work with the startups, right? And I think for startups, it's easy to get excited about the opportunity to work with the corporate, like you said. But the challenge is, if it's not the right fit, then a lot of efforts and a lot of time on the startup side is wasted, right? And for corporates, it probably may be just another experience. But for the startup, it's actually a lot of time.
Absolutely. I think the startup has a much bigger opportunity cost. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you also mentioned about the challenges that we've been seeing already through all these past couple of years. And let's talk a little bit about the CEIBS and actually how you build the next generation of leaders and business owners. Because right now we deal with so many challenges, political tensions between countries, restrictions, people can't travel, wars, right? A lot of uncertainty as well. And I guess most of us don't know how to deal with this. We are not ready for this. So how at CEIBS you addressing this issue to make sure that the next generation of leaders are capable, equipped and ready to build a better future?
That is such a great question. So we have multiple degree programs at CEIBS, but the one that I'm most involved in is our only full-time degree program, the MBA. The average age is about 29. So you have people who have some degree of experience, 5-6 years, but the vast majority of their career lies in front of them. And we've introduced this line to describe what this experience could be about and what lies ahead, which is venture into a changing world. And I think that echoes very well what you're talking about. And I actually find a very interesting parallel between something I say in the book and what I think is the experience of these MBAs. And that is that there are 3 mindsets that are extremely important in dealing with this very complex world that we're in. The first is an entrepreneurial mindset. And this has nothing to do with being in a startup or not. It is whatever you do, you need to be proactive, innovative, being willing to take risks. A second important mindset is having a collaborative mindset, working with others. You may not be able to do everything yourself. And third is to have a global mindset, which might sound a little counterintuitive given all the talk about decoupling, deglobalization, and so on. But in fact, I think we're seeing that the more you talk about this, the more you realize that you can't actually just simply walk away. We have become really interdependent over time. And how this plays out on the MBA, for example, is this is one of the, I think, relatively few MBA programs where entrepreneurial management is a core course rather than an elective. We have something called the E-Lab to support and encourage people with entrepreneurial interests and so on. And basically, one of the things I say from the beginning as MBA director is, be proactive. You are sitting on a big set of opportunities and networks at CEIBS, but it'll only help you if you leverage them actively. And then, in terms of the collaborative mindset, there's so much group work and so on. And sometimes it can be, I'm sure, annoying to students because you don't always get the teammates you want. But, that's, I think, the reality of the workplace and, figuring out how to work with others with complementary skills to help get things done. That becomes a very, very important skill that applies in so many different contexts. And the global mindset, I think, is so important. And that's where our school is so unique. We talk about China depth and global breadth. But actually, we talk about building responsible leaders who are knowledgeable about China depth and global breadth. And so having this global mindset is about engaging with people across cultures. Some of our graduates go and work for Western multinationals working in China. Some of them end up in Chinese companies, some of which still have strong international aspirations. But on the responsible side, I think all of them realize that from a global standpoint, when it comes to climate change, for example, we're all in this together. In terms of COVID, we're all going to be okay only to the extent that everybody is okay, and so these interdependencies also apply in terms of having a mindset that's global, recognizing that we are interdependent, but we also need to be thinking more broadly about societal impact. So through the curriculum, through these extracurricular activities people get, I very much hope, they cultivate these 3 mindsets. And I think that's just useful for all of us to keep in mind. I keep reminding myself about this too, yeah.
Thank you.
And by the way, I've seen so many of your videos, and I think there are so many people you've been talking to in this amazing series where you see examples of all of these 3 mindsets, being entrepreneurial, being collaborative, and having a global mindset.
All right, and to finish this chat, because I think it's next meeting happening very soon for you, what would be 3 pieces of advice that you usually give to entrepreneurs or business owners to help them to navigate through these turbulent times?
We talked about these 3 mindsets a moment ago, but I want to talk about 3 other things. And, these words might sound a little big, but I think the ideas are relatively straightforward. And in fact, I happened to be studying a non-profit organization that I know very well. And I thought, actually some of the things they're doing can be very helpful for people pursuing for-profit entrepreneurship or in startups or in big companies. The first word is obliquity. The second word is frugality. And the third word is paradoxicality. So what are these? The first, and I borrowed this idea from a British economist called John Kay, who said, very often we end up being successful when we pursue goals obliquely. And what he meant by that is to ultimately get something you want, say profit, focus on an intermediate goal, for example, customer satisfaction. So you ultimately want financial reward, but be oblique in the way you follow or pursue this by focusing on what it will take to do this. Too many people sometimes are so obsessed with the end result, which at one level is important, that but if you overdo it, you forget what it really takes. You need to add value. You need to make sure customers are satisfied. So that's about the obliquity piece. The second, about frugality, is basically doing more with less. So there's a lovely book on frugal innovation that a professor at Cambridge, Jaideep Prabhu, has written with a co-author, Navi Raju. And a lot of the examples come from India, but also other contexts, both in emerging and advanced markets, where the idea is you try to, not necessarily always go for this Silicon Valley model of high impact innovation, which also tends to be high cost. We saw this with GE, for example, where they developed scanner machines that were portable, much cheaper than their traditional machines, by leveraging their research centers in emerging markets, for example. But I think that it's more about a mindset. And there's been a lot of that in China too, actually. Even though now we see high-end innovation, I think there's been some a long tradition of doing things frugally. And I think when times are tough, thinking in those terms are important. And paradoxicality is basically the idea that you need to hold contradictory tensions in your head. There's a recent book called Both and Thinking by Wendy Smith and Marion Lewis. And it's basically, the Western logical way of thinking is very much about either or choices. And there are some cases where, you have to make very clear trade-offs. But very often you need to be doing things simultaneously, thinking about the short term and the long term, thinking about work and family life. And, rather than trying to resolve these tensions, sometimes you need to embrace them and learn to live with them. And I think actually, there are Chinese philosophical teachings from Taoism and so on, which have really understood this very well. So be oblique, be frugal, and embrace paradox. Those would be my 3 pieces of advice.
Those are the golden pieces of advice. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your sharing. Lots of insights, lots of food for thinking. I look forward to the next book, the one you mentioned, and I look forward to your next speeches on big stage in Shanghai and beyond.
Thank you so much. Thoroughly enjoyed this, and I really admire how you drive so well and ask such interesting questions, and it's clearly a capability you've developed. So thank you for including me.
Thank you so much. That was an episode Between Meetings. Please like, share, comment, and we'll see you next time.